Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to have Eszter Kovács here today for the first talk in the NewVoices Women in History on Education talk series on Astell. And Eszter is Assistant Research Fellow at the Research Institute for Politics and Government at the University of Public Service in Budapest. And she's also an associate member of the Institute IHRIM in Lyon. And she holds a master in French and in Hungarian and a PhD in French literature. She carried out studies in philosophy as a postdoctoral researcher in literature, and she's currently working on a PhD in philosophy dedicated to early modern female conceptions of liberty. And her main research interests include Diderot, Montesquieu, Émilie du Châtelet, and Mary Astell. And I'm not going to waste much time and just going to let you talk, Eszter. Thanks for being here today.
Okay. Thank you very much, Clara, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for accepting my talk, my proposal, and welcome everybody. So I will share my screen and we'll see whether it works out. We have tried it some minutes ago. So I entitled my paper, Mary Astell and Female Self-Improvement and Self-Mastery. And first of all, I would like to show you two portraits, but maybe you know that these are not the portraits of Mary Astell because there are no surviving portraits about her. And we often see two portraits in editions or in biographies or in monographs about her, but neither of them portrays Mary Astell. But one of them is the portrait of a young woman from the early 18th century, and the other is a portrait of a famous learned woman, The Excellent Woman. And I think that the first illustration corresponds to our image of femininity related to Astell, to Mary Astell, and the second to our image of her austerity. And that's very important because she just incarnates these two ideas, femininity and austerity. And I would like to read my paper, but sometimes my slides, so it's not always the same as I will read out. I have my major quotations, but I would like to summarize in my slides my paper. So we will slides about different information, so summarizing things. So Mary Astell outlines in the first part of the serious proposal, published in 1694, the project of a retirement for young women who are not inclined to marry or who prefer studies before choosing a husband. After having received diverse criticism, she returns to this question from a different viewpoint in the second part. Instead of an establishment, she proposes individual self-improvement for women. However, her goal remains collective. Individual self-education is destined to prepare gradual social change. So you can see here the two proposals. And you can see here the entire titles, because these are revealing also a serious proposal to the ladies for the advancement of their true and greatest interest, the first part. And the second part, serious proposal to the ladies, part 2, wherein a method is offered for the improvement of their minds. In my talk, I will focus on the early phase of this program, so the two proposals, this program for intellectual and moral self-improvement, as I aim to show the idea of female rationality and the claim of co-equality on a rational basis appear already in the proposals. The improvement of the mind, the development of the understanding, and the guidance of their will are necessary for women in order to live a happier life. The mastery of harmful passions is also a major goal. So here are some slides. These are Mary Astell's books found in the old library of Magdalen College in Cambridge. So we can see that she was a hardworking lady. And here are some marginalia. So that also proves her hardworking nature. And maybe you know that her most famous text and her most well-known text is the Reflections upon Marriage. So not the two proposals that I'm going to talk about. These are the this is her very, very well-known work, and she deserved the title, the first English feminist, because about this. As I will show, Astell follows a dual logic in her reasoning. On the one hand, she elaborates a reflection on reason, understanding, and the will, which testifies to the use of Cartesian epistemology, and to an early reception of Locke as well. On the other hand, the program of self-improvement that Eszter proposes to young women in the absence of an appropriate institutional education is deeply religious. The study of the Bible, the example of Christian female educators, and the respect of Christian duties are instrumental in female self-education. And I have a slide about liberty, the question of liberty, because actually I came through to the question of self-improvement and self-mastery while studying Mary Eszter's conception of liberty, and it is very important in this framework. While working on this question in Eszter's philosophy, I have come to the conclusion that freedom in her thought is very close to self-mastery and to the guidance of one's will. In contrast, passion can mean unfreedom if they are not directed by belief and rationality. Astell bases liberty simultaneously on faith and on reason. However, self-improvement is also a social program, even if it has to be carried out by the individual. Therefore, I have worked on the early writings of Eszter, namely the first and the second proposals, before analyzing texts written in 1706, namely the Christian religion, and the reflections upon marriage. The educational program of the proposals lays the foundation for the major themes in Eszter's major philosophy: God, knowledge, passions, virtue, freedom, and happiness. As has been shown by Alice Sobel, Eszter's moral writings emphasize the idea of inner freedom, that is, the freedom from interior corruption, which can free oneself from external constraint. Briefly, we can say that for Eszter, liberty is the freedom of the mind. It means to exercise one's rationality and to protect it from coercion, which originates from erroneous or harmful guidance. Therefore, in order to be free, one has to master one's passions and desires, and one has to improve one's understandings. Astell arrives already in her early works at the specific invitation of human liberty, which is to conform one's will to that of God. I will come back to this question, so how to conform one's will to the divine will. Divine will can be known by a rational understanding of what is the best for us and by admitting that the Creator's designs are the best for the creatures. In her first philosophical works, the first proposal, Eszter propounds moral and intellectual improvement for women. While in the first part, she proposed a collective educational program, a foundation of an academy. And that is basically, I just summarize here the program of the first proposal. In the second part, seeing that the establishment of such an institution was not yet possible, she focuses on the improvement of the mind. So the subtitles, we have already seen them, are revealing. Advancement and improvement are central notions in the two parts. Eszter tries to analyze in depth how this goal would be possible for women. The improvement of one's understanding is essential for Eszter to conduct one's will and to be free in this way as much as possible. She seeks change for the individual and urges gradual social change by individual persuasion. Self-improvement and self-mastery represent a higher degree of freedom for women than worldly enjoyments. Eszter connects studies, faith, duties, and incites young women to lead a morally pure life. And as you can see in the last point of my slide, there can be some contemporary nowadays criticism against Eszter's points. So is liberty an unmarried life? Is liberty for a woman life without a male partner? But as we can discuss it later, this is not necessarily the point. I'd like to speak first about reason, studies, and the self, because we are about self-improvement. The self is very important. A key argument is that the self that one has to improve and master is a rational being. Rationality is a central and instrumental notion in Eszter's philosophy, as human beings of both sexes are defined as rational creatures. Rationality is innate in humans, but to be free, one has to claim one's rights to use it. Astell adopts Cartesian dualism for this moral viewpoint. The body-mind hierarchy is decisive in her conception of self-mastery, as the mind has to control the body, and self-conscience has to control simple and immediate desire in order to define higher goals. As Jacqueline Broad underlines in several of her publications on the author, Estell's philosophy is based on the idea of compatibility between reason and faith. A good Christian for Astell is a wholly rational person. She elaborates a self-educational program for fellow women, already in the two proposals. Practicing one's rationality makes part of the self-educational process. Alice Sowell asserts that Ester's views on freedom are different from that of other early modern female thinkers. For Esther, it is not external freedom that makes possible internal freedom, but the opposite. Enslavement is internal in Esther's philosophy. Therefore, physical and social freedom is not the first goal to achieve. One has to free oneself first from harmful passions. Nonetheless, Esther is not indifferent to the idea of social freedom. Individual inner freedom can be regarded as a necessary condition for collective freedom for women. A free being in Esther's philosophy is aware of his or her God-given rationality and uses it in harmony with divine will. Freedom is not defined in the context of one's possible action, but in one's possible understanding. Independence is not represented as the sphere to act, but as the sphere to comprehend. Therefore, self-improvement is a key to assure freedom for women. And we will see how to improve oneself. So in the first proposal, a key question is how to improve oneself. And SP1, of course, it is the first proposal, the first part of the series proposal, and SP2, of course, the second part of the series proposal. The actual proposal to young ladies is to choose a religious retirement before marriage or instead of it, and to aim for moral and intellectual improvement. Esther depicts this establishment as an academy rather than a monastery and intends to give a philosophical basis to her idea. Several passages of this early work can be related to the understanding and to the will, on the one hand, and to the goal of freeing oneself from the rule of habit and from prejudice, on the other hand. The text is explicitly destined to women and conceived in a female educational perspective, although Esther raises general philosophical questions as well. In the preface, she proposes instance inward beauty instead of outward beauty. Inward beauty is the goal to achieve for those who have natural charms, meaning an advantageous physical appearance, and as outward beauty cannot serve inner freedom. For those who have not been given natural charms, inward beauty can substitute for it. Esther's the idea of real excellency and that of a virtuous grace, which is ensured in women by the improvement of their mind. She also intends to prove that female self-improvement receives divine approbation. The goal is therefore not only to receive worldly appreciation for it. She uses a set of metaphors known from moralists to pose mundane and inner values. For instance, women must rather correct irregularities of their mind than to consider irregularities of their face in the mirror. Knowledge, understanding, will, and freedom are linked already in the first proposal. If we understand amiss, we will come back to this idea, then we will amiss. So an erroneous understanding leads to an erroneous volition. Astell is for a methodical and self-conscious exercise of one's will and claims that women are unfree if they cannot judge for themselves. As Jacqueline Broad points out, Astell tends to discern the will from the love of material things. Will and desire are not the same. Astell's starting point is that the female sex has defaults to correct. She's firmly against vanity and distractions, as the soul is not meant to serve the body, and happiness is not to be achieved by bodily pleasure. In her opinion, women are subject to pursue mundane distractions as they cannot dedicate themselves to higher intellectual occupations. She claims that male superiority over women is the result of a socially different and gendered education. She reverses the patriarchal logic and asserts that women are not incapable of studies, but they are deprived of them. This situation fixing their place and limiting their intellectual ambition. Thus, the lack of knowledge is the consequence and not the cause. Quote, the incapacity of wisdom and self-improvement, I add, if there be any, is acquired, not natural. Astell also considers typically feminine vices and claims that self-improvement is necessary not only in studies, but in morality as well. Astell seems to suggest that self-improvement is necessary to understand what can be obtained, in which and why. She urges religious education for women, in which she would require more theological depths and less tradition. That is, more metaphysics and less ceremony. So that is the first quotation on the slide. And you can see particular irony. It's very typical of Mary Astell's writing. She, quote, she is, it may be, taught the principles and duties of religion, but not acquainted with the reason and grounds of them. Being taught, it is enough for her to believe, to examine why and wherefore belongs not to her, unquote. Of course, it's very ironical. Irony points to the need to change. Religious education must be rational and applied to the understanding and questioning, not to pure mechanism of pious behavior. Collective education serves this goal. As has been said, the actual proposal Eszter makes is to establish a religious community for the intellectual and moral betterment of women, called retirement. She conceives this establishment as a secure institution that women can leave if they wish to do so. Quote, "You are therefore, ladies, invited into a place where you shall suffer no other confinement but to be kept out of the road of sin," unquote. However, the goal of the place is not celibacy. A young woman can leave and get married if she wishes to do so, but as a peaceful place of self-education. The love of God will be the only love in this community, and women dedicate time to study and contemplation. Eszter doesn't plan to educate an intellectual elite or to create concurrence for male thinkers or scholars. She claims, for example, that languages are necessary for reading, but she prefers a few well-chosen books for women instead of a wide range of readings. She advises philosophical readings instead of plays and novels. So this is a quote, it's not on the slide, but it's quite famous. And since the French tongue is understood by most ladies, methinks they much better improve it by the study of philosophy, as I hear the French ladies do, Descartes, Malebranche, and others, than by reading either novels or romances. And why shall it not be as gentle to understand French philosophy as to be acculturated in French mode, unquote. Eszter conceives happiness already at that time, while she was only 28, as a pious duty and self-consciousness, even though she doesn't analyze passions as much in detail as in the second proposal and in the Christian religion. When I say the Christian religion, of course, is the work by Eszter entitled The Christian Religion. She centers her argumentation on the rational control of physical pleasure. Directing pleasure, as we will see, towards God, permits us to reconcile human nature and noble reason. Excessive pleasure, on the contrary, is to be avoided, and it means unfreedom. And that's the second quotation. It's quite famous. It's about a special kind of epicurism. It is, in truth, the highest epicurism, exalting our pleasures by refining them, keeping our appetites in their due regularity, not only grace, but even nature and reason require, in the breach of which, though there may be a transport, there can be no true and substantial delight, unquote. Parallelly, capricious will doesn't make us free or happy. Even if temporarily satisfied, it leads to unfreedom and unhappiness. Eszter bases her conception on the contrast between a solid divine will and the vicissitude of human life. Thus, happiness lies rather in being able to model one's life on the constancy of the divine than on the inconstancy of the human. And this is a slide about to summarize what she says about the guidance of one's will. Quote, this is the last part of the third part of my slide. "There is a sort of bravery and greatness of soul which does more truly ennoble us than the highest title, and it consists in living up to the dignity of our natures. For she that can do so gives evidence that her happiness depends not on so mutable a thing as this world, but in a due subserviency to the Almighty, is bottomed only on her own great mind," unquote. So mutable a thing as this word, it's a very important idea in Eszter's thought, and also to live up to the dignity of one's nature, and of course it's reason which will help us. And I have already mentioned this idea that in Eszter's thought, if we understand amiss, then we will amiss. So one has to improve one's understanding to will to want what he or she should want to do. And now the first proposal, of course, it has been criticized, and Eszter wrote the second part of the proposal, partly to answer this criticism, but also to further develop her ideas. And therefore, the second proposal is destined to the improvement of one's mind. So it was published 3 years after the first, and it contains further reflections on knowledge and moral improvement by bettering one's understanding. Eszter concentrates this time on individual self-improvement and not on life in a female intellectual community, So it's not the religious retirement, but individual work on herself. Astell warns women decidedly against incogitancy, so that's the contrary of knowledge, and asserts on the first pages of the second proposal that an ingenious woman is no prodigy. So you can achieve it, that's the idea. But this aim can be achieved by consequent self-improvement. In the first chapter of the second proposal, she draws a parallel between ignorance and vice. If these conquer one's life, so ignorance and vice conquer one's life, the mind is disturbed in its understanding and its will. Knowledge, which belongs to the mind, and purity, which concerns the heart, are interlinked. Esther seems to suggest that being morally pure, which can be interpreted as sexual abstinence before marriage, and dedicating oneself to improve one's knowledge and understanding leads to a higher form of life for a woman. And of course, she considers women as rational creatures all the time. The second proposal also contains several important reflections on rational human agency. Rationality is a distinctive feature of human beings and gives them therefore the possibility of choice. Choice must follow a precise reason, and human beings can be judged according to the righteousness of this. And there is a very interesting and very important quotation about a more conscious choice, which means a freer choice, and why people and why men and women are rational creatures and why they can be rewarded or punished for their decisions. Because as irrational creatures act only by the will of him who made them and according to the power of that mechanism by which they are formed. So everyone who pretends to reason, who is a voluntary agent and therefore worthy of praise or blame, reward or punishment, must choose his actions and determine his will to that choice by some reasonings or principles, either true or false. And in proportion to these principles and the consequences he deduces from them, he is to be accounted, if they are right and conclusive, a wise man, if evil, rash and injudicious, a fool. So here's the basic idea. So we choose, we act, we decide according to reasons, and we can be judged following the righteousness of these reasons. As we can see, choice reveals one's principles, and the consequences of one's choice reveal the accuracy of the person's thought. Deliberation and forbearance are not mechanical, therefore not schematic. One must be conscious and responsible of one's choice if one pretends to be free, and must improve oneself to be able to use this faculty. Astell also claims that the pursuit of happiness is in human nature, which is a very widespread idea. But for children and young people, the use of the will precedes the appropriate understanding. And here is an interesting idea. Why do we have to improve our quote, indeed, our power of willing exerts itself much sooner than that rational faculty, which is to govern it, unquote. So the aim is to learn to govern one's will. Thus, improving one's mind means to strengthen the understanding, opposed to simple action without weighting one's reason. A more conscious choice means a freer choice to Esther. Esther is radical as for prejudice or erroneous custom, which means to erect tyranny over our freeborn souls. And here are some interesting quotations about prejudice and how do we choose amiss, why do we use in an erroneous way our will. She claims that our understanding is such that it should constantly search after the truth, therefore should not be directed by convention, custom in her words, or authorities. Following these without one's own reason can indeed be harmful. Astell once again draws parallels. That's the first quotation. As prejudice fetters the understanding, so does custom manacle the will, which scarce knows how to divert from a tract the generality around it take, and to which it has itself been habituated, unquote. So a custom is a very negative notion here, and you shouldn't follow custom because it can be completely erroneous. As she recommends, instead of following custom or being determined by prejudice or common opinion, the will must stand to God. For Astell, our intelligence is finite, but it can be improved. Quote, for being that we are but creatures, our understanding in its greatest perfection has only a limited excellency, unquote. However, humans cannot be dismissed of voluntary agency as rationality is necessary to freedom. And another quote, we are conscious of our own liberty, Whoever denies it denies that he is capable of rewards or punishments, degrades his nature and makes himself but a more curious piece of mechanism, unquote. So it's very interesting that the idea of mechanism, that people are not mechanical and our mind and our will is not a mechanism. We can understand it and we can improve it. It's very important in Esther's thought. In the search after truth, Esther distinguishes between self-evident truths, reasoning, and deduction. She claims that faith, science, and opinion are but different modes of the understanding. She underlines several times that even though human beings have finite minds, their understanding can be improved and enlarged. She even thinks in terms of improving the will by nuancing one's understanding. Quote, all the irregularities of our will proceed from those false judgments we make through want of consideration on a partial examination when we do consider, unquote. So when we are in error, when we make an error, when we just misunderstand something, it's up to us. She suggests that the will can be rationalized and oriented. She also considers talent and competence. The use of intelligence must be adjusted to one's capacity. And I think that it's this slide. So it's already about the question of talent. So if we are talented, we can improve our mind, but how to use our talent? So quote, God does nothing in vain. He gives no power or faculty, which he has not allotted to some proportionate use. If therefore he has given to mankind a rational mind, every individual understanding ought to be employed in somewhat worthy of it, unquote. So basically that is also a major idea that if we are talented, we have to use this talent, and we are not talented for nothing. And everybody has to be conscious of his or her talent and use it according. She doesn't say, however, that intellectual capacities would be equal, and underlines that a talented young woman must be even more aware of the need of her self-improvement. So the more talented you are, the more aware you have to be. She considers divine perfection and creaturely perfectibility in the 3rd chapter of the 2nd proposal. She reasons as follows. Human beings have an idea of perfection. From the idea of perfection, we can deduce that of existence. If we suppose something all perfect, it must necessarily exist, as our partial perfection can only have been allotted by this necessary existence. So that's her argument for the existence of God. It's not necessarily very original, so there are more original ones, but it is part of her argumentations. Following this, creatures can only have partial perfections, and they cannot have received it from another creature, but from an all-perfect and thus necessary being. This argument for the existence of God, which, as I have just said, it is not necessarily original, is integrated in the self-improvement program. If humans are perfectible, they have to improve their mind, and thus their existence. The aim to perfect one's mind has direct and practical consequences for women. For instance, oral, written expression has to show their rational understanding. Esther recommends writing for women which respects the truth, shows a real conviction, but is not altered by art or ornament. She redefines authentic knowledge by speaking of a natural writing style, and there is a short definition which is very interesting. Thinking comfortably to the nature of things is true knowledge. So in Esther's opinion, if we arrive to think conformably to the nature of things, that is our knowledge. She underlines the capacity of women to improve not only their understanding and their judgment, but their linguistic expression in conversation and in written language as well. She claims that women are not naturally inferior in these competencies, but they do not practice reading and writing enough. Nonetheless, the talent to philosophize is not given to anyone. For Astell, one can be a good Christian without having mental capacities above others, but those who are intellectually gifted have to improve it. And this is the last quotation on this slide. Quote, our powers and faculties were not given us for nothing, and the only advantage one woman has above another is the being allotted to the more noble employment. It is very interesting because there is a passage in which it says that even a servant can be a very valuable person. It's not her work to write or to manage a household, but she still has to improve something in her, because everybody at every level of the society can improve something in his or her life. The last chapter of the second proposal, entitled Concerning the Regulation of the Will and the Government of the Passions, is the most important regarding the question of happiness. Esther closely interlinks happiness and virtue. Inner freedom and self-mastery are important for both. And here's the idea of divine will and self-discipline. As Jacqueline Broad argues, Esther's definition of virtue comes from Henry Moore, but her treatment of the passions is Cartesian, insofar as passions are not necessarily harmful or avoidable. Nonetheless, one has to regulate one's passions. Modeling our life upon divine will seems to be the utmost goal. Esther claims in the last chapter of the second proposal that it allows us to achieve freedom and happiness. And this is a longer quote. That God's will is the rule of ours is methinks so plain that it needs no proof. For why do we prefer a thing but because we judge it best? And why do we choose it because it seems good for us? Now, God being infinitely wise, all his judgments must be infallible. And being infinitely good, he can will nothing but what is best, nor prescribe anything that is not for our advantage. And this is the model, this is how we should will things. Of course, we cannot arrive to this all the time, but that's the idea. The rightness of God's will is the consequence of divine attributes. Even though human beings do not share these attributes, in Esther's view, they have followed the same principle, to wish what is the best, not to wish what procures only momentaneous pleasure. If we wish what is not for our real good and long-term good, we will arrive to unfreedom. Thus, the divine model of choosing what is best must be the human principle of self-discipline. The body-mind relationship plays a key role in Esther's theory of happiness from this early phase, even though she writes less on passions in the serious proposal than in Christian religion. In her view, the mind has to control the body, but one has to be conscious of bodily effects, rather understand and surrender them. And this is the human side, the bodily side, quote, for if we disregard the body wholly, we pretend to live like angels, whilst we are but mortals. But if we prefer or equally to the mind, we degenerate into brutes, unquote. Passions are not bad in themselves, since they are part of human nature, but they should not invade the mind. The soul can master the passions and leave the mind free. The regulation of the passions is carried out in a soul-body-mind interaction. And this is, actually, I entitled this slide, Love of God, the Estellian Standing Rule for Women. And you might recognize standing room, it comes from Locke. So that is in a famous passage in the second treatise on civil government. But of course, we are before. But this is the standing rule. And actually, Esther has a standing rule for women. My last quote, to wind up all, the sum of our duty and of all morality is to have a temper of mind so absolutely comfort to the divine will, or which is the same in other words, such an habitual and entire love of God, as will on all occasions excite as the exercise of such acts as we are necessary consequent of such a habit. So it's a very difficult quotation, and I find that regarding contemporary English, it's even a bit syntactically confused, but of course it's 17th century syntax. But basically what she says is that we have to make a habit, we have to make a custom, we have to accustom ourselves to be, to think, to act as conform to divine will as we can, the most reasonably and the most rationally use it. It is the final slide, but I think that yes, I have just find this quotation. This is very important on passions. So as I have just said, she's not against passions, but she is for the mastery of them. It is not a fault to have passions, since they are natural and unavoidable and useful too. But the fault lies here. We suffer them too often to get the mastery of the mind, to hurry it on to what objects they please and to fix it there, so that it is not able to consider any idea but what they present. Whereas the soul can, if she please, and if she makes use of her authority in time, divert the course of the spirits and direct them to a new object. So finally, she tries to find a hierarchy. So the mind, we have to master the mind in order to master the passions, and because the mind has to master the body, and it is the soul who can divert the mind and just to focus on other objects. And there is, before just coming to my conclusion, I would like to draw your attention to the use she makes of these words with self. So you can see that there is self-education, self-improvement, self-awareness, self-mastery. And still, as I know Astell, and I think that Astell scholars would be would agree that there is nothing selfish or individualistic in Mary Astell's philosophy, because self-love in a moralist sense, just as amour-propre, it's really, really absent from her philosophy. So even if we can have the impression that she concentrates, that she focuses based on the self, on self-education, self-improvement, self-mastery, and self-awareness, as self-love is missing from it, there's nothing selfish about it. So the self is defined in the context of the faith and reason. And I would like to just very, very briefly conclude before the discussion. As we can see, so Astell's program might be classified as a sort of theological feminism, since it reunites faith, practical Christian duties, and a plan for the intellectual improvement of women. For her, improving general female conditions must start with the betterment of the individual. And since everyone must be capable of strengthening one's understanding, this is the first step to take. However, her early works intended as a practical, moral, and educational guide for young women have a metaphysical background. For Astell, rationality common to men and women proves co-equality, although social status, political order, and a different education create inequality between the sexes. Nonetheless, the understanding and the direction of the will can be equally improved in women if they are themselves willing to engage in it. Self-improvement, self-awareness, and self-mastery are therefore a way to Astell to compensate for social inequality. Thanks.